Welcome to the Changing Earth podcast with Sara F. Hathaway, blending survival, fiction, and fact to bring you entertaining education that'll help you dream, survive, and thrive. And now, here's your host, Sara F. Hathaway.
Today, I have the great honor of welcoming Bill Simpson to the show. Captain William E. Simpson II is a U.S. Merchant Marine officer with decades of boating and expedition sailing experience. Having logged more than 150,000 miles at sea, Captain Simpson has successfully survived long-term off-the-grid at sea and at remote uninhabited desert islands with his family for years at a time. In 2013, Captain Simpson appeared on National Geographic's hit TV show Doomsday Preppers, Season 1-3b, Forest at Sea, and received the highest score ever given for disaster preparedness and survival, earning the title of Best Prepper. He holds a USCG 500-ton captain's license for commercial inspected passenger vehicles, and he is also a commercial airplane and helicopter pilot. In 1987, Captain Simpson received a commendation from the U.S. Coast Guard Honolulu sector for his assistance in the successful rescue of 2 sailors lost overboard at sea. In 2010, Captain Simpson was again instrumental in the successful rescue operation of an American sailor lost overboard in the Sea of Cortez in hazardous seas. Captain Simpson is also an accomplished writer covering disaster preparedness. His work has been featured and republished via numerous magazines and websites, and he has been a featured guest on various disaster preparedness radio talk shows. To find out more about Captain Bill or the Nautical Prepper, head on over to www.williamesimpson.com. That's www.williamesimpson.com. Captain Bill is here to talk to us today about resourcefulness, and I thought it was a good time to hit on this subject because of how resourceful Erica was with the building of her craft that eventually gets her out the door. So let's listen into this great conversation that I had with Bill.
Bill, you have quite an extensive list of survival skills, watercraft survival being one of those. How important is this ability to be resourceful in a survival situation?
Well, thanks for having me on your show. Appreciate it, Sarah. And so to answer your question, basically, the thing that always was interesting about MacGyver, for instance, was his ability to take a look at a situation and to quickly encompass any resources that were available to him and then integrate those into a solution. And so with regard to resourcefulness, the skills, those are your primary skills, you know, being able to assess your situation, where the priorities are, what are the priorities of the risks and things that you're currently exposed to, and what resources or assets do you have immediately available that you can draw upon based upon your knowledge and your skill level.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with the book. Is what does she have? What could she MacGyver up to solve her problem?
From reading the chapter, it seems like she's kind of in an area where they stored a lot of things. So obviously, you know, when she started looking at flotation, when you're in a water environment, is obviously the difference between drowning and staying alive. She obviously doesn't have life jackets or anything, so you know, throwing together that little life raft with the table and the used water bottles is a good idea, I think. Although in practicality, you have to consider things like the stability of a craft. You know, if you're going to build a raft, for instance, if the buoyancy is basically under the center of the load, you tend to have a lot of rolling motion and dynamic instability in the raft. So you have to basically do a raft that would be akin to, for instance, the Polynesians built these ocean sailboats that were a dugout canoe, which without the pontoon off to the side, creating the dynamic stability, it would be a very unstable watercraft. But in the case of a raft, if you spread your buoyant points of buoyancy, if you spread those apart so you've got some distance between them, then you get a lot more stability than if all the flotation is right under where you're sitting. So spreading those things apart would give you more stability, which is important because if you're rowing or pushing, you're gonna create these rolling moments in the platform. So that stability is important. Those water bottles, 5-gallon water jugs, for instance, which you use, I think, if you're actually in a situation where you're trying to build a raft, plastic water jugs are useful. Basically, when you're building anything that you want to float, you have to take in consideration Archimedes' principle, which states that the buoyancy created by any submerged object is equal to the weight of the water that's displaced. So, for instance, if you've got a 5-gallon water jug, you've got 5 times 8. Water weighs 8 pounds a gallon, so you've got about 40 pounds of lift. I've actually refloated boats that have sunk before using 55-gallon oil drums. And the 55-gallon oil drum gives you about 440 pounds of lift, but in order to figure out your total net lift, you have to subtract the weight of the object. The drum weighs about 40 pounds, so your net lift, the amount of force that will keep you above the water, is about 410 pounds. So in her case, building the little table in the raft was a good solution.
I like your mention of the little dugout canoes that they build over in Polynesia with the side stabilizers that they put out on there. Is that the ones you were referring to?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, those have always been really, really cool to me. I grew up in the Great Lakes, so seeing different crafts like that have always been interesting to me. And that's why with this one, I kind of went with the classic pontoon boat theme, because I figured, pontoon boats, they tend to have really good stability as long as the waves are not too big. But in her situation, she didn't really have to worry about that. But no, those dugout canoes would be a great idea as well. If you had just a center thing you were sitting on, but you needed to stabilize it as well. So that's a great point there.
Yeah, if you had a couple of telephone poles and you put a couple of beams across them, 2x4s or whatever, you could mount chairs on the telephone poles pretty much and sit in a chair with some oars, and you could actually kind of move along. I mean, that's the whole idea, is to have that the extended weight on that moment arm, on that big lever arm way out on the side from your canoe, which gives you the stability of your because if you've ever been canoeing, you know how easy it is to tip over.
Yes. And they're a pain in the butt to get tipped back over, too. We had to practice that. And now it's just, it's easier if you have 2 boats. But when you only have 1, that's just a nightmare right there.
Yeah.
So you have been out on the water a lot. You are the Nautical Prepper. So can you give me a story where your ability to be resourceful has saved you in the past?
Oh, well, when we've done a lot of expeditionary sailing where you're out there for years at a time, so you have things that happen, pretty much monthly. Something will come up that can be fairly serious. You can, and in my case, a lot of times there were sailboats around us who got into trouble and needed help. So, there's some of the events involved mechanical events on other boats. We had a sailboat that was broken down. They had some damage to their mast, and they were depending on their main engine, and they sheared off the drive line. And they were in this little bay, and they were pretty much stuck there and needed help. so we went over there, and I had a shop on our boat. Our boat was fairly large. So we had a shop, and I had equipment. And we went over there, and we were able to actually weld their driveline back together again, which allowed them to get back to land. There's different things that can happen, and you never know when or where or what kind of a problem might arise. I spent some time in Hawaii, working with Coast Guard Auxiliary, and occasionally people would go out to sea, and things would happen. There was an occasion where some sailors, a couple of guys, were on a boat. It was a smaller boat, and they were in the Alinui-Aha Channel, which is a fairly rough channel between the islands. And one of the gentlemen fell off the boat, and he didn't have a life preserver. Fortunately, the water there is really warm, but there are currents and sharks and other hazards. But the good news is he wasn't going to, immediately go into hypothermic state. So the sailor that was left in the boat was able to turn the boat around, and he got close enough to reach down to try to grab the guy, and he got pulled into the water.
Oh,
But not before. I mean, the good news is he was thinking, and as soon as his partner went in the water, he did call the Coast Guard and to give a general position, and then explain that he was going to try to go back and retrieve the guy out of the water. So the good news is the Coast Guard got the call, and before he ended up getting pulled into the water. So both guys were in the water. The boat sailed away by itself, empty, with no people on it. And the Coast Guard in Hawaii is kind of spread thin, so they ended up calling on the auxiliary because one of the main rescue vessels coming from Honolulu was going to take a while to be on scene. And so some of the auxiliarists, and myself included, we got into the search mode for these people. The good news is ultimately they were found and retrieved from the water before they drowned or before the sharks got them. But you've got a situation where these gentlemen should have been wearing their life preservers, because a lot of times if you can stay afloat long enough, sooner or later somebody will find you, or maybe you'll find something floating, some debris or a log or a container or something out there that you can get some additional buoyancy on and get more of your body out of the water. But those are the kind of things pretty much we've run into. We spend a lot of time planning and preparing, and even at the professional level, there's things that do happen. But usually, the kind of problems we had on our boat were, equipment occasionally would break down, but we were always in a position to repair it. So that kind of was the extent of it for us.
Yeah, that's nice to have the shop ability on your boat where you could fix parts and things like that on your vessel. I've never been on a vessel that is that big that we had that option.
Yeah, and it requires a fairly large boat. Our boat was 70 feet. It was steel and 100 tons. So we had the ability to have those kinds of things, and which was a benefit to the boats around us as well, because we were able to, come and provide aid to different sailboats. I think over the course of our last 4-year voyage, we probably rendered aid to maybe a dozen different vessels or more in different places, because when you go down into like the Sea of Cortez, it's quite remote and help is far away. I mean, this one guy who sheared his driveline was talking on the shortwave radio to a tugboat that was 400 miles away from his location. They were going to charge him $15,000 to come to his location and then tow him back to a port where he could be repaired. And so it's, you get out there in the boonies like that, if you're not set up to handle it, it can be a real problem.
Yeah, an expensive one too, it sounds like. So if you were Erica and you're leaving the bunker in this raft, what are going to be your 3 top concerns as far as survival till you hit the shore?
Well, given that, in the book, she's floating in this, toxic, contaminated water, You've got that concern. You obviously, and there's no chemical breakdown, obviously, of what's in the water. We don't know how toxic that water is or what kind of exposure could lead to, a poisoning or death. So, obviously, you don't want to get into that water. So your craft has to be high and dry. But and depending on how far away you are from land, fortunately, in her case, she could see land. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can get to land. The Coast Guard reports that most people end up in boating accidents. Most people die within the sight of land. So just because you can see land doesn't mean you're saved. So staying afloat, protecting yourself from exposure, and maintaining your hydration are going to be probably the most important things right off the get-go. You can go a long ways without food. There's lots of stories of people adrift in life rafts that have gone 45, 60 days without food. They had some water, but that's what kept them going. And usually, if you can live long enough, if you have enough water and you've got a reasonable amount of, you've got a decent survival craft, whatever it might be, in this case, an oak table, you've got enough time to figure out a way to get some food. People have caught birds. Obviously birds, especially out at sea, or maybe even in Erica's situation, birds might be looking for a place to land. That happens quite often at sea, where people are out in a life raft drifting in the middle of the ocean, and a bird will be coming along, like an albatross or whatever, and they want to land on something to take a break. And when they do, the survivor on the craft grabs them, and they've got something to eat. So, if you can stay alive long enough to start, having chance favor you, chance favors a prepared mind, as they say, that's the key. And water is probably the biggest concern when you're out there in the open like that, because you're gonna have a lot of water loss through perspiration, especially if you're in her environment. She's got clothing on, she's paddling, so you're going to be. That's one of those situations where you will probably be using, maybe 3 gallons or maybe even 4 gallons of water a day, depending on how hard you're working. If you're accustomed to warmer climate and things like that, I can get by nowadays on, if I have to, I can get by on a half a gallon of water a day. But that's through conditioning. It's not that great for your kidneys, but I've actually tested myself. You don't want to do that out of habit. You should always drink at least a gallon a day. But in her condition, she's going to go through water pretty quickly. So water is going to be the most important thing, aside from staying afloat above the toxic waste.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking. And she had the jugs. Well, in hindsight, I would think that she would need more than that. And I wasn't sure about if you could, once you had all those chemicals that we keep around for survival, for gasoline and oils and, the pesticides that we use on the farms and stuff like that, once you had that all sloshed together, I wasn't sure about the ability of like a solar still to take out those toxic levels and leave behind a clean drinking water.
Well, the problem, a solar still is good for water that has basic sediment and maybe, the kind of things you find in a stream or a lake, that's not contaminated with industrial waste. The problem with some industrial waste is the boiling point of some of these compounds is much lower. The vapor pressure is much lower, so it will condense on your condensing area. So if you have a little plastic screen that you're condensing water against, and then it's dripping off into a cup, if you've got things that boil off before the water do, they may condense and contaminate whatever water that you distill. So refining water that has certain chemicals in it can be much more difficult and quite possibly beyond the ability of a normal solar still. So, at that point, she probably wouldn't be able to use the solar still.
Right.
But on land, if you've got a mud puddle or a rain puddle or a stream, you've got, there might be giardia or there might be some sort of parasitic cysts or mud or minerals that are toxic. You've got arsenic in some water. Some of these mountain springs that look quite inviting, they're bubbling and cold, can have toxic levels of arsenic in them and other things. So you just don't want to start drinking that stuff unless you know what you're getting into. And boiling water doesn't remove some of these toxic minerals, such as arsenic, for instance. Water that has mineral toxicity, boiling it all day long isn't going to help you. That will kill the giardia and certain cysts and things like that, parasitic things, bacteria, viruses, but it doesn't get rid of these other types of poisons. So
you're not actually filtering out those minerals, so they don't have anywhere to go when you boil them except fall to the bottom because they're heavier, right?
Well, they'll stay in solution. Actually, the warmer the water gets, the more the capacity of the water is to hold minerals in solution. Of course, then we're starting to talk about chemistry, where you have a supersaturated solution because it's warm, and if you cooled it maybe to some, just above freezing, that some of these things might precipitate out. But, in a survival mode, you're not going to be able to play chemist like that. You're going to have some pretty simple things, like some of these life straw and some of these other things take out very basic things, and they're good for short periods of time. But, if you're in an environment where you think you're going to be facing various types of chemicals and things like that, it's going to take additional preparations and quite possibly, storage of known pure water, sources of pure water. Well water, near the cities groundwater can be polluted by toxic spills. In your case, Erica is in this big earthquake, and, a lot of the engineering codes and building codes requires a certain level of protection. Some of these big steel containers around these chemical plants and things are required to have the ability to withstand certain types of environmental hazards, fire, earthquake, things like that. But nonetheless, some of those things do occasionally break. Railroad cars come off the tracks, and these container cars full of chemicals bust open and leak everywhere. And so, those kinds of situations present a problem for groundwater contamination, surface water contamination for sure. And so you're kind of left with trying to obtain pure water, and there are even some rare circumstances where maybe you have radioactive fallout, for instance, in a nuclear event or some sort of volcanic event that you mentioned. In her case, if you're fairly close to some of these volcanoes, they spew a lot of these very toxic gases, and in fact, some of them actually create their own weather when the hot air rises up in the atmosphere and causes the cooler, moisture-containing air to condense, and you get rain and thunder and lightning over these volcanic eruptions, and so you get precipitation downwind a little bit, and a lot of that precipitation is toxic. So even sometimes rain can be not potable.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. Yeah, and those pictures are beautiful too. When their volcanoes are making their own weather patterns over the top, and then you don't really think about the implications of what's going on there when it creates its own water pattern and creates those clouds to pour all of that toxic rain down on you. That's a great point there. All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming on to the show. We're going to have you back for episode 4.
A big shout out to Captain Bill Simpson for gracing us with his presence here on the Changing Earth podcast. And you did hear correctly. He will be back here next week to share some more nautical tips with us. So we're all extremely excited about that. I want to thank you very much. I hope you guys all enjoyed the show today. Erica is finally getting free, so next week we'll get to see what she's doing there on her raft, and it was great talking with Bill. Thank you very much for being here. Remember, till next time, dream, survive, thrive.
Thank you for joining Sara for this episode of the Changing Earth podcast. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Day After Disaster at www.author.sarafhathaway.com. If you love this podcast, please head over to iTunes and let everyone know by leaving a review.